The world is in debt of $340 trillion. But the total income of the entire world is around $100 trillion. That means global debt is 3 times higher than what the world earns in a year. Sounds strange, right? But mathematically, this is impossible. So how did this all happen? And most importantly, this was done deliberately. To understand this, let's go back in history. This system was designed 300 years ago by 4 bankers. Over 3 centuries, they created a web so tight that no one can escape it. Not you, not me, not our country, not any country in the world. Today, I'm going to show you how this web was created, who created it, and why every country on Earth is drowning in debt that is mathematically impossible to escape. Now listen to a fact that will shake your mind. Every country in the world is in debt. America alone has $38 trillion in debt. Japan has $9 trillion in debt. China has $13 trillion. And even Russia has $450 billion in debt. Altogether, the world owes $340 trillion in debt, 3 times the size of the entire global economy. Now stop for a second and think. If every country is in debt, then who gave this money? If everyone has borrowed, then who is the lender? Did aliens lend it to us, or did this money come from Mars? The question sounds simple, but when you hear the answer, you'll need to sit down. This money didn't come from anyone. It was created out of nowhere. Yes, out of nothing. So how is that even possible? To understand this, you need to hear the story of 4 bankers. One by one, they created a system that has trapped the entire world. This wasn't a secret master plan designed 300 years ago. The system evolved step by step with time. Now let's start with the first man. To understand him, you need to understand the world before 1694. Back then, countries weren't like they are today. There were kings, and kings needed money. They needed money to fight wars. They needed money to build forts. And they needed money to pay soldiers and other government expenses. So what did kings do? They borrowed money from wealthy merchants. They promised to repay the money with interest, and if they couldn't repay, the king would simply say, "I can't pay, forget it." The merchant lost everything. Sometimes, kings even threw the merchant into jail so he wouldn't come asking again. Then the king would borrow from another merchant. The system get reset. Debt was temporary, either repaid or refused, but it was never permanent. Then came a man who changed everything. His name was William Paterson. He was a Scottish merchant. He had failed multiple times trying to get rich, spent half his life wandering, struggling. In 1691, an idea came to him, one that would change the fate of humanity. At that time, England was at war with France. The king was William III. He was desperate for money. The treasury was empty. Wars aren't cheap. Think about it. Soldiers needed salaries. Each soldier earned 2 to 3 pounds a month. 500 soldiers meant massive monthly expenses. Weapons, guns, swords, ammunition, all had to be ordered from factories and paid in cash. Warships for naval battles took years to build and cost thousands of pounds. Food and supplies, feeding 500 soldiers every day. Horses, transport, tents, uniforms, daily expenses, sometimes even mercenaries, foreign soldiers who were even more expensive. Taxes weren't enough. The treasury was empty. The king wasn't personally poor. He had palaces and servants, but the country's money was gone. And if England lost the war, everything would collapse. Old merchants refused to lend money again because England had defaulted before. That's when Paterson approached the king with a proposal. He said, "I'll form a group of wealthy merchants. Together, we'll lend the government £1.2 million. At that time, the government meant the king and Parliament together. The king couldn't decide alone. Parliament had to agree. Parliament was a gathering of wealthy elites who ruled alongside the king. Paterson proposed lending the government £1.2 million,
which today would be around $300 million.
Now here's where Patterson's real trick begins, he said. You don't have to repay the loan. The principle was simple. The £1.2 million will never be returned. The government will only pay interest forever. 8% interest every year. Now think about what that means. You borrow $100. You never return the $100. You only pay $8 every year. After you die, your children keep paying. After them, their children, but it will never end. You might ask, why would merchants agree to this? Are they crazy? Give money to king and never get it back? And who guarantees the interest? That's where Patterson's genius appears. The merchants wouldn't give money directly to the king. A new institution would be created first, and its name was the Bank of England. This was the world's first central bank. A central bank meaning a bank that controls all other banks, that lends directly to the government, that controls the nation's money. Merchants would deposit their gold in the Bank of England. The bank would use that gold as collateral to lend money to the government. But what if the king refused to pay? Patterson solved that problem too. The guarantee would come directly from Parliament, not only the king. And how would Parliament guarantee it? Of course, through taxes. As long as the people of England paying taxes, the merchants would receive their interest. Kings could die, governments could change, but as long as the country existed, as long as people pay taxes, the interest would keep flowing. It is easy money while sleeping. Parliament approved this scheme in 1694 and passed the bill. The Bank of England was created. Merchants deposited gold. The government got war funding. And for the first time in human history, a nation's debt became permanent. Debt was no longer a problem to solve. It became a feature of the system. But the most dangerous part hadn't even arrived yet. The Bank of England received another power. It could print paper money against government debt. Now, I need you to understand this carefully. Earlier, gold was money, right? If you had gold, you were rich. If you didn't, you weren't. Now came a new concept, the paper money. The bank printed notes saying, "This note can be exchanged for gold at the Bank of England." The government borrowed £1.2 million. The bank printed notes against that debt. Now what does that mean? The government borrowed money. Against that debt, new money was created. Those notes entered the market. The more the government borrowed, the more money the bank printed. If this isn't fully clear yet, don't worry. Later, when we reach Morgan's story, I'll explain this step by step. For now, understand the template Patterson created. Step 1. Government borrows money. Step 2. New money is printed against that debt. Step 3. The principal is never repaid. Step 4. Interest is paid forever. Step 5. The cycle never ends. If you're a banker, this system is brilliant because you earn money while sleeping. But if you're an ordinary person, or I say a taxpayer, this is a complete destruction because you're paying interest on a debt that will never end. Patterson died in 1719. He didn't become personally rich, but the system he created is still running 331 years later. Britain's debt has never been repaid, only expanded. That was the first web. Now stop and meet the second architect of modern banking system. Patterson made debt permanent, but with some limitation. One country's merchants lent to one country's government. Now, if that government defaulted, the merchants lost money, and the rest of the world wasn't affected. England's problem stayed in England. France didn't care. Germany didn't care. The second architect broke this limit. His name was Nathan Rothschild. You may have heard his name before on Instagram Reels. First understand the Rothschild family. Rothschild family consists of 5 brothers, each dominating banking in one of Europe's 5 major cities, like London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. 5 cities, 1 Rothschild in each city. Now focus on Nathan Rothschild, based in London, the most cunning brother among them. At that time, Europe faced a man called Napoleon, a French general trying to conquer the entire continent. England, Austria, Prussia, Russia. Everyone needed money to fight him. Nathan saw an opportunity, and started a new kind of business. First, understand the old way of debt. A government needed money. It went to a wealthy merchant. The merchant lent money from his own pocket. The government paid interest. Simple, right? So what was the problem? Only extremely rich merchants could lend to governments. There was no entry point for small investors. Now understand what Nathan did differently. Now for more clarity, I'll explain it with a vegetable market example. Imagine a vegetable market in your town. Farmers bring vegetables and sell them directly to customers. Simple, right? Now imagine a man comes and says, "I'll sit in the middle. The farmer will sell to me, and I'll sell to the customers. The profit in between is mine." That's exactly what Nathan did. But instead of vegetables, he did it with debt. When a government needed money, it wrote a paper saying, "We have borrowed £1,000. We will pay the holder of this paper £50 every year as interest, and after 10 years, we will return the £1,000 as interest." This paper is called a bond. A bond is simply a promise. A government's promise to repay money with interest, written on paper, which can be sold from hand to hand. Earlier, governments sold these bonds directly to rich merchants, but only the very rich could buy them, because each bond was expensive. Nathan said, "Give the bonds to me. I'll break them into smaller pieces and sell them to thousands of people." Here's what changed. Earlier, one government bond might be worth £10,000. Only a few ultra-rich people could afford it. Now think about the problem. Suppose the government needs £100,000. In the entire country, only 20 people can afford a £10,000 bond. If 10 of them refuse to buy, the government only gets half the money, and convincing those rich people could take months or even more. But Nathan solved this problem. He said, "I'll split a £10,000 bond into 100 bonds of £100 each."
Now what happens? Earlier, only 20 people could buy, but now 2,000 people could buy the bond. For example, a doctor could buy it, a lawyer could buy it, a shopkeeper could buy it. Anyone with a little savings could participate in bond investment. When more people want to buy, bonds sell faster. The government gets money in weeks instead of months, and the Rothschild sat in the middle, earning commission. They sold a £100 bond for £102 or £103. £2 or £3 profit on every bond. Now another new concept was born, the secondary market, a place where bonds could be bought and sold between investors. Suppose you bought a bond. Now you urgently need cash. Earlier, you would go to the government and say, "Hey government, give me my money back." And the government would say, "Come back after 10 years. But now, you could sell the bond to someone else, bought today and sold tomorrow, cash in hand. Nathan Rothschild organized this entire system, every country's bonds, everywhere, debt being traded like vegetables. Now understand why this was so dangerous. Before Rothschild, if a government refused to pay, one merchant lost the money, right? He suffered alone. The rest of the world felt nothing. England's problem stayed in England. France didn't care, Germany didn't care, Poland didn't care. But after Rothschild, things were changed. British government bonds were held by French investors. French bonds were held by German banks, and German bonds were held by Austrian princes. Everyone became connected. Now ask that what will happen if Britain says, "We won't pay." Let me explain it to you with a village example. Robert gave John a $100. John gave that $100 to Thomas. Thomas gave it to Henry. Henry gave it to Lucas. Everyone is happy, right? Everyone holds a paper saying, "I'll get a $100 in exchange of it anywhere, anytime." Now the problem is, one day Robert says to John, "Give me my $100 back." John says, "I don't have it. Thomas has it." Thomas says, "I don't have it. Henry has it." Henry says, "I don't have it. Lucas has it." Lucas says, "I don't have it either." Now what just happens? You can see the pattern. If one falls, everyone falls, like dominoes. That's exactly what was happening in Europe. English bonds were held by the French, French bonds by the Germans, and German bonds were held by the Austrians. All were interconnected. If England refused to pay, English bonds would become worthless.
One country falling would pull down the next, and then the next, like a full domino collapse. This was Rothschild's real move. He spread debt so widely, across so many people, across so many countries, that no single government could refuse to pay. Refusal now meant destroying the entire global financial system, and no one could afford that. In 1815, the Battle of Waterloo took place. Napoleon lost the battle. Nathan Rothschild received the news in London before the British government. His private messenger network was much faster. He used this information to make an enormous amount of money, equivalent to millions of dollars today in a single day. By 1820, the Rothschild family controlled Europe's debt. Any government that needed money had to go through them. They controlled investors. They controlled distribution. They set the terms and policy. And most importantly, no government could default anymore. The option to say no was gone. Governments were trapped deliberately. They had to keep paying interest, even if their people starved. To pay old interest, they had to take new loans. Rothschild did the second big thing. He made debt global. Everyone was connected. Debt was no longer just permanent, it became inescapable. This was the second web by Rothschild family. Now pause for a moment. We've talked about Rothschild, who make the debt global. Next we'll talk about Morgan, the third architect, and the most powerful one. So far, we have understand. In 1694, Patterson made debt permanent. In 1815, Rothschild made debt global. Now all countries were connected through debt, but there was still one limit. In those days, banks were normal banks. These banks took deposits from people and gave loans to others. But there was a hard rule. A bank could only lend as much money as it had. If a bank had $100 million in deposits, it could lend at most $100 million, not more. That meant governments were also limited. They could only borrow what banks actually had. This limit was broken by the third architect. His name was J.P. Morgan, John Pierpont Morgan. He was the most powerful banker in American history. Now understand what happened. By 1900, America was rising fast. Factories were being built vigorously. Railways were expanding. Steel plants were coming up. The economy was growing and expanding. But America's banking system was weak. There was no central system. Banks were scattered. Money supply was tied to gold, meaning that America could only print money equal to the gold it possessed. Then came the Panic of 1907. Here's what triggered it. Two businessmen, Augustus Hines and Charles Morse, tried to corner the copper market. Their plan was to buy all the copper mine, control supply, raise prices, and make millions from it. The plan was failed. Both went bankrupt. So what was the problem? They were also connected to multiple banks. When people heard they had collapsed, they assumed those banks would collapse too. The biggest trust company involved was Knickerbocker Trust. People got panicked. They lined up outside banks to withdraw their all money. Now understand something important. Banks don't keep your money sitting in lockers. They lend it out to people and businesses. So when everyone demands cash at the same time, the bank doesn't have it. Knickerbocker Trust collapsed. Then people lost faith in other banks too. They rushed there as well. One bank after another started collapsing, like a house of cards. The entire system was about to crash. J.P. Morgan saw this and understood one thing clearly. If banks collapse, the entire American economy can collapse. So what did he do? He called the biggest bankers of New York to his own house, into his private library. He locked the doors and said, "No one leaves until we solve this crisis." He forced those bankers to put their own money into saving the failing banks. They pooled funds and stabilized the system. One man, J.P. Morgan, saved America's entire banking system. But Morgan was already 70 years old. He knew he couldn't do this again. So he and his allies thought, we need a permanent solution. A system that can handle every crisis. A system where money never runs out. They needed a central bank, just like Patterson had created the Bank of England. A central bank is the father of all banks, the one that prints money, the one that decides how much money exists. But there was a problem. Americans hated central banks. America had tried to create a central bank twice before. Both times, people protested and shut it down, saying, "These rich bankers will rule over us." So Morgan and his allies decided, this time, we work in secret. In 1910, a secret meeting took place. Morgan himself didn't go. His trusted representatives went to the meeting. For about a week, they stayed hidden and designed a plan. So, why it was secret? Because if Americans found out that the richest bankers were secretly deciding how the nation's money would work, there would be riots. People would take to the streets. So they created a very clever illusion. They decided, we won't call it a central bank. We'll call it the Federal Reserve System. Federal sounds like it belongs to the government, right? Reserve sounds safe, like money is stored. System sounds like decentralized. On the surface, it looked democratic and public-friendly. But inside, there would be 12 regional Federal Reserve banks. Yet real control would sit at the top, with the Federal Reserve Board and, most importantly, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which would be controlled by Wall Street banks and Morgan's banks.
In December 1913, this bill was rushed into the U.S. Congress just before Christmas holidays. Most representatives didn't fully understand it, so they just approved the bill. The Federal Reserve Act became a law. Now listen carefully. This is the most important part. I'll now explain, step by step, how money is created out of thin air. First, a small example. Imagine a grocery shop in your town. The shopkeeper's name is Thomas. You go to him and say, "Hey Thomas, I don't have money right now. Give me groceries on credit. I'll pay on the 1st of next month." Thomas opens his notebook and writes, "John owes $100. Now think, did Thomas suddenly get an extra $100? No, he just wrote it in his book. But now, in his accounts, he has an asset, $100 that will come in the future. That entry has a value. Now scale this up to the Federal Reserve level. The government needs $100 million. The government creates a bond, a promise to repay. The Federal Reserve buys this bond. Now ask the real question. Did the Fed already have $100 million lying somewhere? Did they print $100 million? No. The Federal Reserve simply makes a computer entry. $100 million is credited to the government's account. No printing press, no money trucks, just a digital entry. Now the government spends that $100 million on salaries, contractors, roads, and different projects. When the government transfers $100 million, its account balance goes down, and the contractor's bank account goes up. Still, no physical cash. If the contractor later withdraws $200 from an ATM, only then does the bank request cash from the Fed. Only then do notes enter circulation. So the sequence is, first, money exists as reserves, then bank deposits, and cash appears only when demanded. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve holds the bond. That bond is an asset for the Federal Reserve System. Now the government must pay $5 million interest every year. And where does that come from? It will come from taxes. Yes, it will be your money. After 10 years, the government must repay $100 million. So after 10 years, does the government have that money? No. So what does it do then? It issues new bonds, new debt to repay old debt, and the cycle continues forever. Earlier, there was a limit. Banks could only lend what they had, but now there is no limit. The Federal Reserve can create money from nothing. The government will never be told no. Unlimited borrowing becomes possible, but interest payments always come from taxpayers. People wake up, work hard, and pay taxes. That tax goes to the government, and part of it goes straight to the Federal Reserve as interest. Morgan died in 1913, the same year the Federal Reserve was created. But his legacy is the structure that allows America to hold $38 trillion in debt today. Without the Federal Reserve, this level of borrowing would be impossible. Money didn't exist.
Now money is created from air without any limits. Morgan made debt unlimited. This was the third web. America today has over $38 trillion in debt, and this debt will never be repaid. Why? Because if the government repaid all debt and withdrew all the bonds, there will be no money left in the market. Remember how money was created. It was created through debt. If debt disappears, money disappears. There would be no money left in the market, nothing to buy and nothing to sell. The economy would freeze. So repaying debt is not an option. Debt must always exist for the system to function. This is the same system, started in 1694 by Patterson, globalized in 1815 by Rothschild, and unlimited in 1913 by Morgan. But there was still one problem. Some countries took loans and simply couldn't repay. They get defaulted. They said, "We can't pay the loan or pay interest." So when default happened, debt was forgiven or reduced. The system reset. This was a problem for bankers. The debt trap was breaking in places. That's when the fourth architect arrived, Paul Volcker. Volcker was chairman of the Federal Reserve from 1979 to 1987, the most powerful position in America's central banking system. Now understand what was happening then.
In the 1970s, inflation in the US had gone out of control. Everything was getting expensive. The dollar was losing its value. Volcker had to stop this. So what did he do? He sharply increased interest rates. Earlier, loans cost about 8 to 10% interest. Volcker pushed rates close to 20%. Loans became extremely expensive. As a result, people borrowed less, spent less, and inflation came under control. This was good for America, but it was devastating for poor countries. Now understand Latin America, the Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina. In the 1970s, when interest rates were low, these countries borrowed billions of dollars from US banks. They needed money for development, factories, roads, and infrastructure. At that time, interest was around 8 to 10%. It seemed manageable. But when Volcker raised rates to 20%, their interest payments more than doubled. Earlier, on $100, they paid $8 in interest. Now they had to pay $20, and these countries were already struggling. Even $8 was hard to arrange. Where would $20 come from? In 1982, Mexico announced that, "We cannot pay. We are defaulting." Now understand how dangerous this was. American banks had lent this money. Citibank, Bank of America, and Chase Manhattan. If Mexico defaulted, these banks would collapse. If banks collapsed, the US economy would shake. Volcker had two options. So started with option one, let Mexico default. Let banks suffer the losses. Teach them a lesson so they lend responsibly next time. The market would correct itself. Option two, find a workaround and save the banks. Here Volcker chose option two. He created a new system, using the IMF. So now what is the IMF? The International Monetary Fund, an international institution that provides emergency loans to countries, Volcker said. The IMF will lend money to Mexico. Mexico will use that money to keep paying interest to American banks. Banks will stay safe, but the money from IMF won't be free. There will be some conditions and limitation. These conditions were called structural adjustment programs. So what does it mean? Change your economy structure? Change your policies? Do what we say? So what were these conditions? Condition 1. Cut government spending. Spend less on schools. Spend less on hospitals. Reduce welfare schemes for the poor. Condition 2. Privatization. Sell government-owned companies. Sell water companies. Sell electricity companies and sell telecom companies. Condition 3. Open markets and allow foreign companies to enter, even if local companies collapse. Condition 4. Devalue your currency. Make your peso weaker. Exports become cheaper, but imports become expensive. People become poorer. These conditions were brutal. Ordinary people suffered badly, but banks were saved. And most importantly, debt was not forgiven. It was only restructured.
Now, what does that mean? Earlier, Mexico had to repay $80 billion in 5 years. After restructuring, Mexico still had to repay $80 billion, but over 15 years. The principal didn't reduce, only time was increased. New loans were used to pay old loans. This was Volcker's real move. When debt becomes impossible to repay, don't forgive it. Restructure it. Give just enough money to keep interest payments flowing. And in exchange, take control of the country. Volcker did the fourth thing. He made debt inescapable. Debt became a tool of control. This was the fourth web.
Volcker died in 2019, but his legacy lives on till today. A system that ensures debt is global, permanent, and impossible to escape. Countries are never allowed to default. They are refinanced and dragged into endless debt. Interest keeps flowing to the same banks, to the same institutions, to the same system that Patterson started in 1694. This is a 300-year-old web that now traps the entire world. Everything you've heard so far was history, but you might think, this is about big countries and governments. What does it have to do with me? Yes, it has everything to do with you, because this system connects directly to your pocket, your salary, and your life. Now let's see how this system affects you personally. Every year, the US government allocates money in the budget just to pay interest on debt. In 2024 to 25, this is around $1 trillion. Only for interest, not the principal. Where does this money come from? From your taxes, GST you pay on coffee, biscuits, clothes, phones, and income tax deducted from your salary. The government collects all of it, and a huge portion goes toward paying interest on debt. Understand this clearly. You drink coffee in the morning. You pay GST on it. That money goes to the government. The government uses a part of that money to pay interest on debt. That interest goes into the account of some bank or financial institution. When you fill petrol and pay tax on it, that money ultimately reaches bondholders. You don't see this directly. You think you're paying tax for development. Roads will be built and schools will be built. But a large part of your tax is being used to pay interest on debt. And because debt never ends, taxes never go down. You will keep paying forever. This is a legal transfer of wealth from your pocket to the pockets of rich people, every year, permanently. Now understand one more thing. That affects you the most is inflation. Inflation is a side effect of this entire system. Imagine a town with 100 kilograms of wheat and $100 in circulation. Each kilo costs $1. Now someone injects another $100. Money becomes $200. But wheat is still 100 kilograms. Now each kilo costs $2. The wheat didn't change. Money increased and prices rose. That is called inflation. And how does inflation affect you? The value of your salary and the value of your savings falls. Something that cost $10 10 years ago now costs $30. Your salary doubled, but prices tripled. That means you're poorer than you were 10 years ago, even though your salary increased. This is wealth transfer, slow, silent, and invisible. Assets mean property, land, and gold. Because during inflation, asset prices rise, but salaries lose value. The rich get richer. Their $1 million property becomes $3 million. The poor get poorer. Their $3,000 salary feels like $1,000. Expenses go from 300 rupees to 900 rupees. This system is designed this way. Central banks print money. Inflation rises. The purchasing power of the poor falls. The wealth of the rich increases. This cycle repeats every single year and forever. If you think you got some value from this video, like this video and I will see you in the next amazing video.